Hey there, folks. So today we're going to be talking about some of the persistent questions in psychology. You could also think of these as persistent questions about the mind or persistent questions about human nature. These are questions that philosophy and psychology and a lot of other social sciences have struggled with pretty much since the beginning of formal thought. And one of the difficult things about these questions is it's hard to get at scientifically. So some questions are easier to answer scientifically, like does changing the type of font that you use improve reading comprehension? Right? If you wanted to do that, you could take one group of people, give them a text in one font, take another group of people, give them a text in another font, and then you see how well they remember or understand it, right? You can scientifically observe that. But how do you scientifically observe something like, does God exist? Or how do you scientifically observe something like, are humans good or evil? We start getting into questions that, while they're questions worth asking, are questions that are a little bit harder to observe in a lab or a little bit harder to define in scientific terms. So let's take a look at 10 of these persistent questions. The first one, is behavior freely chosen or is it determined? In other words, does free will exist? Now, this can be an especially tricky one because there's so much disagreement about what we mean when we say free will. Some philosophers, when they talk about free will, they mean political freedom or social freedom, right? Having the freedom to act on your own desires and the freedom to follow your own path, right? So maybe somebody who's living in a totalitarian dictatorship might have less free will than somebody who's living in a free democracy. Other philosophers, when they talk about free will, they mean that there's something within the human mind that is unexplainable in terms of physical, material causes. So, first of all, we have to think about what we mean when we say free will. And then let's look at the debate. So, on one hand, you've got something called materialistic monism. Sometimes it's just called materialism. But this is the side that says free will is sort of an illusion, right? I have this sense in my head that I'm making a decision freely. But in reality, I'm being influenced by my biology, by the sum of my experiences, my brain connections, and by my cultural influences, right? That biopsychosocial model we talked about at the beginning of this unit. Compare that to dualism. So we'll see in the next lecture that many of the ancient philosophers were dualists. They believed that there was a split between the physical world and the mental or the spiritual world. So, yeah, I've got my brain and I've got these physical influences and I've got these cultural expectations, but there's something beyond that that you can't really explain in terms of physical or natural processes. That there's something out there in the mind that we just can't really explain in rational scientific terms. So part of the questions here that come up with modern psychology, how much free choice do we really have if behavior is motivated by things like biological drives, like my drive to preserve myself or to preserve my tribe, or your desire to procreate or your desire to protect your reputation or territory, and how much of this is being driven by conditioning, like reinforcement and punishment. So we'll get to how different philosophers and different psychologists have addressed these questions later on in the course. So the second one, what's humanity's inherent nature? Is humanity inherently good or is it inherently evil? And what do we even mean by things like good and evil? So if you think about modern schools like humanism would say people are generally good and interested in the common welfare of others and trying to reach their highest potential. Psychoanalysis, on the other hand, takes kind of a dimmer view of human nature and says that, we're primitive and basic and selfish unless we are educated and socialized to be good. Or maybe, like in the behaviorism school, all behavior is driven by what pays off. If being good is rewarded, then people will be good. If being bad is rewarded, then people will be bad. Um, Different philosophers have viewed this in different ways over the times. Somebody like Thomas Hobbes believed that humanity was inherently bad and that without good laws and good order, then life would be nasty, brutish, and short. Somebody like, what was it, Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed that humanity was inherently good, right? He believed in this idea of the noble savage, and that really it's civilization and laws that corrupt people. So later on in this course, we'll take a look at how these different schools of thought, like humanism and psychoanalysis and behaviorism, have tried to get at the basics and fundamentals of human nature. So a third question, what's our relationship to animals? Up until, about well, for most of humanity's existence, right, for most of the 200, 300,000 years of our existence, most people assumed that humans and animals were, different sets of things. Now, maybe some of the early hunter-gatherer tribes viewed themselves as just part of nature, but soon after that, you start seeing evidence that there's a split in the way that humans view themselves and the way that humans view other animals. In fact, we often see in those early cultures splits between how a particular group of people view themselves and how they view other groups of people, right? Like, oh, those other groups of people are just animals like deer and cattle, and we are the only people who are real people. Or is the difference between human and animals maybe a little bit less than some people might have thought? This is, a big point of evolution and Darwin's theory of natural selection, that humanity shares common ancestry with the other primates, that, at some point we had a common ancestor and one branch went one way and became the chimpanzees, another branch went another way and eventually became the humans, and so on and so on. So is it just that we are more highly evolved than other animals? And what does it even mean to be highly evolved? Right? Evolution isn't Pokemon. It's not about getting better and better and better over succeeding generations. It's about fitness for your specific environment. So if that's the case, are humans really more highly evolved than animals, or have we just adapted for specific purposes? Number 4, how are the mind and the body related? We'll see in the next chapter that, again, this is a big point of contention for the Greeks and the Romans. All of them believed in a soul and in gods, pretty much. And it was just a question of, is the soul a physical thing? Are the gods a physical thing? Or are the soul and gods these sort of ethereal things that represent something completely different from the physical realm? So materialism, matter is the only reality. Everything can be explained through the laws of physics. Idealism is that everything is just ideas, right? There is no reality. If you ever met somebody who believes that we're living in a simulation, right, that would be sort of like idealism, that there is no real physical reality. Or dualism. Dualism was the major school of thought throughout the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages up until the Renaissance. This idea that, well, yes, there's a physical world that exists, but there's also this mental and spiritual world that's separate and apart from it. So it's not like we're living in a world purely composed of ideas, but there is this world of ideas out there beyond the physical realm. That's the idea of dualism. So 5, nature versus nurture. How much of behavior can you explain through genetics and biology and predispositions? And how much of it can you explain through environment and education and the sum of our experiences over time? So nature, biology, genes, things like that. Nurture, our experiences, our memories, our educations. So this comes up quite a lot when we're talking about debates on intelligence, right? Is intelligence something that you're born with? Is intelligence something that you can learn and build over time? And we'll come to some of those issues later on in the semester too, and we'll see what the latest evidence has to say on nature versus nurture when it comes to intelligence. Number 6, mechanism versus vitalism. So can behavior be explained in terms of machines? Can we use machines as an allegory for human behavior? Or is there something that is unique to human behavior that can't be explained through these mechanistic processes? What we're going to see is, over time, philosophers and psychologists tend to use whatever the most complicated piece of machinery that happens to be lying around is as a metaphor for human behavior. So for Socrates, that was a chariot where you had to direct a whole bunch of horses at once, or even two horses at once, and that can be a tricky task. We'll see later on that people compare the mind to a clockwork machine. Later on, people compare the mind to a computer. Now, some people try to compare the mind to quantum physics. So whatever the most complicated thing in that era is what people tend to compare the mind to if you're talking about mechanism. Whereas vitalism says, it's not really a relationship between machinery and the human mind, right? It's a false analogy, according to vitalism. 7, where does knowledge come from? On one hand, is knowledge something that we get directly from sensory experience? We see this now in a school of psychology called embodied cognition. The embodied cognition says that you can't really think about something without activating a sensory experience of that concept. So if you don't have any direct experience with it, you can't really think about it in a way that's accurate. On the other hand, some people might claim that the mind can actively transform this information, right? Think about, you've read a book about a place that you've never been to. Say you've never been to France, but you might have this idea of France in your head based on what you've read in books that talk about the country or that describe it. Or is some knowledge innate? Are there some things that we're born with? We'll see when we get to the Renaissance era and the early modern era that many of those philosophers like John Locke believed that no knowledge was innate, that humans were born kind of this blank slate. You could just write anything on that slate and get any kind of human you wanted. But, on the other hand, maybe there are some things that humans are born innately knowing, right? Now, here I don't mean that they're born knowing what a cat is or what a dog is, but there might be some sort of mental reflexes that they have that allow them to learn things quickly and learn things easily. Number 8 is rationalism versus intuition. So what's the best guide for behavior? We saw a little bit of this last time when we talked about the ways of knowing. So is it better to rely on logic and systematic thought and deliberate thinking, or is it better to rely on intuition? There are plenty of people out there today who will tell you that you should always trust your gut and your gut's not going to lie to you. And there are plenty of people out there today who say, oh, your gut's full of prejudices. Your gut's full of, mental shortcuts and lazy thinking, and it might be quick, but quick doesn't mean it's accurate. So when should we rely on one versus the other? When should we be relying on our intuition, and when should we be relying on more systematic, deliberate, rational thought? Number 9, what's the nature of reality? Are we living in a reality that is completely subjective? There have been many thinkers over the years who believe this. You see it in some schools of philosophy, some schools of Eastern philosophy as well, that posit that the world that we're living in is completely an illusion, that the idea that there is a thing called a tree and you can't change that tree just by thinking about it is itself an illusion. The idea that there is some kind of concrete reality that cannot be changed is an illusion if you believe that reality is subjective. So in other words, if enough people believed in a thing hard enough, that thing would become real. So if you believe reality is subjective, you might say to yourself, okay, well, there's not such a thing right now as the god Zeus because not enough people believe in him. If enough people believed in Zeus, then there would be a Zeus. On the other hand, people might say reality is objective. I might believe that I can pick up a snake and not get bitten, but if I pick up a snake, that snake's not going to care what I believe, right? That snake's probably going to bite me if I torment it. And I might not believe that I'll get poisoned, but that doesn't stop the poison from working, right? I might believe that I'm immune to bullets, but if I go out and try to test that theory, it's going to be a very short and very violent test, right? So that would be the idea that reality is completely objective. So you can see why this would be a difficult one to study scientifically. What's the nature of a subjective versus objective reality? But you can also see why it's such an intriguing idea to psychologists and philosophers and theologians and lots of other disciplines that study the human mind and human behavior. The last one we'll talk about here, the problem of the self. We have this experience of our mind being one continuous thing, of our brain being one continuous thing. But in reality, your brain is composed of lots of different organs, not all of which came about and evolved at the same time. So Some parts of our brain are evolutionarily speaking, much older than others, and other parts of our brain are newer and sort of had to build on top of that. So, how is it that we view ourselves as a whole unified self? And what's going on when we don't view ourselves as this whole unified self? We'll talk about this when we get to recent discoveries in psychology towards the end of the module. We'll talk about things like, do we have one self that's experiencing events and another self that's remembering the events? Does our brain really contain multiple selves that is integrated through some kind of process? And when we're talking to ourselves, who are we really talking to? This also has implications for certain mental disorders, right? Like people with schizophrenia often report hearing hallucinations. So, are those hallucinations just the same kind of voice in our head that you and I normally have? It's possible. One theory of schizophrenia is that people with schizophrenia have difficulties distinguishing between the internal monologue and some kind of external speaker. And there have been some pretty wild theories that have been proposed to try to explain this. Theories that I don't think have a lot of merit, but are intriguing to contemplate anyway. So we'll talk about those too when we get to some of the more modern stuff, like 1960s and later. Okay, that's where we're going to leave off today. The next time we meet, we're going to start talking about ancient philosophies and ancient approaches to the mind. So we'll look at philosophers like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle, some of the people who came after them, to look at how they approached questions of the mind and what they got right and what they might have been off the mark with. And let's see if we can use what we learned about the ways of knowing and the persistent questions to understand why they got some of this stuff right and why they got some of this stuff wrong. Okay, that's where we'll pick up next time. Thanks.